Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I should also mention that today is also National Video Game Day over in the US. Thank you everyone for coming along this evening. I'm very grateful to the Academy of the Social Sciences to recognise this growing area of psychology and for the opportunity to present the Paul Burke Award lecture. I'm also very thankful for the support of Professors Tracy Wade and Neil Kirby from Flinders University as nominators for the award. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Paul Del Fabro, who's been my long-time mentor and colleague and a good friend too. He supervised my PhD and we've worked together since day one, so this is very much a shared enterprise that's benefited from his wisdom. And Paul's actually away on a beach in Malta at the moment on official university business, so he couldn't be here this evening. This lecture will focus on the subject of video games and the many challenges that we face in recognising a new disorder based on video gaming. And in this lecture I'm going to focus on 4 main challenges in the field. The concept of video games and people becoming hooked on digital technology in general, to put it in very basic terms, has been an area of study that's fascinated me since I was a kid. I grew up with a dad who was a teacher, but he also had his own computer technology business. And his view of the value of technologies, computers, was very much based on their capabilities as tools to help people or to serve some other productive function. But my strongest, earliest memory of computers was sitting beside my older brother, watching him play a video game called Space Quest, watching him fail over and over, his character on the screen being killed over and over by an alien with tentacles. And I felt very quietly satisfied that he wasn't good at everything. Then as I entered my high school and university years, I became more exposed to the notion that computers could be much more than a tool for people. Games were becoming much more sophisticated and social media was exploding in popularity. These technologies were not simply tools, but also they were satisfying psychological needs, they were creating groups, and they were generating new subcultures. People were living and creating their lives through these mediums. So the notion that games are important to people is not really a new idea. Throughout history, the playing of games has been considered an essential and normal activity across the lifespan. Through games, children learn to explore, to develop cognitive capacities, to feel excitement and relieve tension, and to bond with their parents and make friends. Games can provide a simulation that allows people to practice skills and act out roles of who they might want to be in real life. And people play what they like and they get better at what they like by playing games. So while these benefits and functions of play are very well recognised and understood, the massive popularity of online social games has led to some concerns that there are people who may be playing too much. And this brings me to the first challenge: the nature of gaming disorder. How do we know when gaming becomes a problem? Or to put it another way, how much is too much? This question has been challenging for researchers to answer because gaming is an activity that doesn't have quite the same public health implications as other activities, including substance use. It's not quite the same as drinking alcohol or smoking. Many people feel quite rightly that gaming should not be considered in the same way, and because gaming is inherently not harmful to health. Some people may play intensely every now and again, they may play quite episodically, but without experiencing any negative consequences. Moderate use even has some benefits. And we could say the same about basic behaviours like eating and sleeping, or even the act of worrying about the future. These are not inherently problematic activities, but they can be highly interfering and harmful if you do them all the time. The question of how much is too much has been a problem for researchers because there's no definitive answer. It really depends on the individual. How much is too much also really conveys that time is the main consideration to understand the problematic relationship with games. Even if we can measure it very accurately, measuring time doesn't really bring us closer to building a profile of the characteristics of individuals, the symptoms of problem gaming, and the mechanisms that drive the behaviour. Gaming disorder refers to a classification used to refer to people who play games to such extent that it interferes with their family life, with their work, with their education, sleep, hobbies, and social relationships. This occurs when gaming is no longer a positive activity, but one that causes harm. When players are playing without enjoyment, or they're not playing freely, and when they feel unable to stop. So 2018 has been a significant year for the field, with the World Health Organization recognising hazardous gaming as well as gaming disorder in the latest revision of its health classification system, the International Classification of Diseases. And this is the first time gaming disorder has been recognised as a legitimate diagnosis. The ICD-11 provides a very clear statement on the essential components of gaming disorder. It's a disorder defined by three main criteria: persistent and recurrent gaming behaviour characterised by impaired control over gaming, increasing priority given to gaming to the extent that it takes precedence over all other interests and activities, and continuation despite the occurrence of negative consequences. So these criteria emphasise psychological changes for the individual, such as how the individual thinks about games, and a behavioural routine that is causing harm. So the gaming disorder classification in the ICD-11 has attracted some criticism. This is a news article published earlier in the year where some researchers argued that gaming disorder risked pathologising behaviours that are normal for hundreds of millions of players around the world. And it's argued that all gaming becomes stigmatised by having a disorder that refers to harmful gaming. Similarly, we see gaming industry bodies issuing press releases in opposition to gaming disorder by arguing that gaming is enjoyed safely and sensibly by millions of people and calling attention to some of the benefits of normal gaming. But is it really fair to disregard gaming disorder and problematic gaming on the basis that it's a popular activity? It's certainly important for the bar to be set considerably high for new disorders to avoid viewing normal behaviour as clinical or a problem. But the popularity of gaming and the benefits of gaming don't really strike me as the most relevant issues to take into account in discussing gaming disorder. Otherwise, we'd be having this debate for most disorders. We wouldn't say that depression stigmatises sadness or that pyromania stigmatises the act of lighting a fire. With gambling, an activity that's very similar to games, we would not deny the existence of problem gaming or gambling disorder just because most people are engaged at recreational and non-problematic levels. The needs for people too should be considered. People who have seeking help for gaming-related problems should not be disregarded because there are others who don't need help. So moving on to the second challenge, this is about the scale of the problem. How many people are affected by problem gaming and to what degree, and who is more at risk? With debate over the definition of gaming disorder, we see many different approaches to the measurement of problem gaming and problems among gamers. Different questions have emphasised different aspects of behaviour, and they've had different scores and different cut-offs. That's meant there's been a lot of variation. To highlight some of this variability in screening, this figure comes from a study that shows the variation in responses to certain gaming disorder questions across different groups based on their severity of problem gaming. As you can see, that third item along the x-axis refers to loss of control over gaming, which appears to be quite good at distinguishing between normal players and those people with gaming-related problems. The more severely affected group tends to score the highest on this item, making the item very good at discriminating between problem and healthy players. However, further along we see an item called repetition and relapse, which refers to a couple of things, but the way the item's measured is when you lost in a game or you do not get the results you wanted, did you keep playing to achieve your target? And we see that item, actually most people score very highly on that item, so it may not differentiate very well. In contrast, the next item along, disregard for consequences, tends to be endorsed only by the most severe group of problem gamers. So the questions that we ask have very different sensitivity and specificity levels. And sometimes the screening questions don't always get to the heart of the issue, or worse, they can be referring to behaviours which are relatively normal. And so that means we end up with some wide-ranging prevalence figures for problem gaming, which is often used against the existence of problem gaming to say it doesn't exist. There are also some issues in measuring addiction concepts like tolerance and withdrawal when we apply them to regular behaviours like gaming. And while it may be clear in alcohol use disorder, for example, that tolerance is referring to a need to increase the dose or concentration of alcohol over time, it's much less clear what might be increasing for gaming. We end up with questions like this one, which attempt to capture a range of behaviours like increasing time, playing different games, upgrading computer equipment in an attempt to capture this addiction concept. And so while there's been some problems with measuring problem gaming, this is also an area of research that's getting better and better every year. There's been more consistency in the way that we ask our questions about problem gaming, and I think a lot of this consistency has come about because of the 2013 inclusion of internet gaming disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's really important that we recognise that normal gamers make up the majority of gamers across industrialised societies like Australia. Gaming is massively popular and general usage has increased over time. And I want to share some numbers on regular gaming, not just focusing on problem gaming. So studies internationally have indicated that adolescents, the majority of adolescents, over 95% of this group, report playing a video game in the last 12 months across a range of devices, including their phones, personal computers, laptops, consoles. And smartphone gaming in particular is the most rapidly growing field or area of gaming products. Average gaming time among adolescents has steadily increased over the last 3 decades, particularly among males. We see in the Generation M2 study conducted in the United States, for example, that average gaming usage among adolescents increased from 24 minutes to 73 minutes between 2004 and 2009. Currently in Australia, as you can see in this figure, males aged 15 to 24 years play games for an average of 155 minutes per day. Since 2012, the Interactive Games and Entertainment Association have published annual figures on Australian gaming habits, and their latest report is based on 2017 data that involves 1,200 households and over 3,000 individuals. Their report stated that about 2/3 of all Australians play video games. 97% of Australian homes with children have video games. 60% of households have 5 or more screens. 80% of households have more than one game device, and 16% of households have a virtual reality headset. And it's worth noting that gaming begins around the age of 5 years old and peaks in adolescence. Therefore, if problems start to begin in adolescence, most individuals will have had a 10-year history with gaming and established fairly strong gaming attitudes and behaviours. We also have this excellent data provided by the 2015 Australian Child and Adolescent Survey of Mental Health and Wellbeing. This is a survey of more than 3,000 young people aged 11 to 17 in 2014. The study found that about 4% of males played video games for an average of 9 hours or more on an average weekday, and nearly 8% played games for an average of 9 hours or more on a weekend day. So these studies are showing that gaming is extremely popular and very prevalent across all ages and segments of society. That 2015 Australian study also investigated problematic gaming in that group and looked in particular at 5 criteria to indicate problematic gaming: going without eating or sleeping in order to play games, feeling bothered when not playing games, using games or the internet when not really interested, spending less time than they should with family or friends and doing less schoolwork or work because of gaming, and trying unsuccessfully to reduce or stop the amount of time they spend gaming. And it was found that between 3 and 4% of males and females met those 5 criteria. And also they were meeting these criteria without also meeting criteria for depression and anxiety. So it wasn't simply due to some other secondary issue. The study also found that those who reported depression were 4 times more likely to also report problematic gaming. So overall, based on the estimates that we have across studies using nationally representative samples and decent measures, the overall prevalence rate of gaming disorder is thought to be around 1%, and with higher rates for young males. The survey estimates also seem to line up with the experiences of psychiatrists. In a recent study of 289 Australian and New Zealand psychiatrists, it was generally agreed that gaming disorder is a mental health problem that's more common among adolescents. And interestingly, many thought that it was possible to be addicted to not only gaming content, but also to other online activities like online social networking. Being male is not the only risk factor for gaming disorder. Studies show that the #1 psychological risk factor for gaming disorder is trait impulsivity, or the stable tendency to act without thinking and to disregard negative consequences of actions. Some of the other risk factors we've identified are comorbid disorders or conditions like social anxiety, having low self-esteem, and limited alternative interests. We also know that individuals from more chaotic and insecure families who have less structure in their daily routine, who have more access and opportunities to play, and who associate with peers who game more frequently are at greater risk of gaming disorder. The type of game also matters too. Games are very diverse. Just as some people have problems with playing the pokies, or more problems playing the pokies than playing the weekly lottery, we know that certain games, like massively multiplayer online role-playing games, tend to have higher rates of problem gaming among their players. So I've gotten this far without really saying anything about what video games are, which brings us to the third challenge in the field, the evolution of games. Video games are highly varied and always changing, which means that what players are doing and seeking out in games is often changing too. And what is a video game? Well, a video game seems to be best defined according to a set of principles rather than a strict definition. A video game refers broadly to an interactive form of digital entertainment designed to be played, discovered and mastered. The player uses a game control scheme, which might be a keyboard, a controller, or motion sensors, to manipulate images on a visual display, which can be a computer monitor, television or smartphone screen, to reach an outcome that's usually defined as success or failure. Unlike television or movies, the viewer usually wins or advances or loses. Modern games have evolved too to offer unlimited experiences of winning and losing, as well as complex stories and characters, large worlds to explore, and opportunities to socialise. We know that games offer many different types of rewards, not just one single thing. Some of these rewards might operate in a very predictable fashion on schedules of reinforcement that are known to the player. Collect 10 items, then collect 12, then 14 and so on. Other rewards might be presented more randomly or unexpectedly triggered by the player. There's often a mix of familiarity and novelty gated by the requirement of overcoming challenges that provides constant stimulation for the player. Our understanding of addiction mechanisms recognises that some individuals have difficulties in making long-term decisions when they have to choose between immediate gaming rewards over other options. Some players have enhanced reward sensitivity and decreased loss sensitivity, meaning they'll be more prone to gaming for longer periods of time because they tend to have stronger motivations to play. Winning is more exciting for these players, whereas losing is less impactful. Another really important aspect to modern gaming is the player's attachment to virtual goods, actions and identities. Consumer psychology research shows that gamers value their digital collections of games and gaming achievements in much the same way that people value their material goods and their real-world relationships. Gamers with large collections of games tend to regard them as special because they provide a sense of completeness as a record of personal, technological and economic progress in their lives. Players may develop what we might term a transactive relationship with games, in the sense that the game stores a memory of the individual that played the game, like photos in an album. The game keeps a record of what the player did and thought was important to do in the game. The player then values the game for what it says about the player. One implication of this is that people may feel frustration or depression when not playing because they feel disconnected from part of themselves when they're not playing. A part that's stored away and only accessible in the game device. This makes it harder to give up the game because it has preserved a very ideal record of the player's life in the game. If that sounds a little bit abstract, there's some neuroimaging research on gaming that's showing there's neurobiological differences in the areas of the gamer's brain related to self-concept. This is a 2015 study by Dieta and colleagues who found that individuals with gaming disorder were more likely than normal gamers to identify with their game character to compensate for their poorer sense of self. The researchers speculated that the game character might increasingly replace the player's ideal self, or how the person would like to be, in the transition from normal to problematic gaming. In other words, problematic gamers may tend to know themselves better in the game than they do in the real world. The ability of players to become invested in digital characters and worlds is likely to become easier as games offer more convincing simulations. Players in the 1980s may not have cared so much about a character like Mario, for example, represented here as a few pixels on the screen. But in more recent games, players may become more personally invested in the characters as they seem more realistic or compelling or meaningful. Another implication is that the more immersive games become and more complex and larger in scale, they become much more easy to monetize, to introduce monetization features into these games for players to spend money. The introduction of in-game monetization is perhaps the most significant recent innovation in video games. We've seen in the last decade that the gaming industry has taken steps to capitalise on players' interest and attachment to virtual goods in online games. Revenue models for games now emphasise in-game purchasing or microtransactions, which is the ability to spend usually small amounts of money on virtual goods within the game. Some games using these features may appear very similar to the pokies, even though the player is not able to win money back that they spend on the machine. Last year, just to give you an idea of how popular these features are, one of the top gaming companies, Activision Blizzard, posted a $4 billion revenue from in-game purchases of microtransactions. Earlier I asked how much is too much, and I think this question may also refer to some players' financial investment in games. The monetisation of games prompts us to consider what is it that's actually rewarding the player when they play games, and whether some of our current models of gaming disorder are adequate for describing financial gaming behaviour. An example of this is the player's interaction with systems in games that prolong the gaming session. Systems like quests and loading times that require the player to spend and invest an increasing amount of time in order to obtain rewards in the game. Cognitive dissonance theory may explain why some players continue to play the game despite having to invest more and more time to obtain the reward. Gaming in this example would be maintained by the belief or the thought that it must be worth it if I'm spending this much time at it. With the introduction of financial spending in games, we now have to turn to concepts, or we may benefit from turning to concepts in behavioural economics to understand how players justify spending decisions. For example, the endowment effect states that individuals tend to ascribe more value to things that they believe they own. And so, applying this to games, we'd say that gamers are more likely to take actions to retain ownership of their virtual items, like paying subscriptions. Players may then feel that they've invested too much money or time in order to quit. The design patents that are registered by companies for game design features are also quite interesting for highlighting how the companies are now exploring new ways to monetise games and getting players to spend in game. For example, this is a patent that refers to a system and method that manipulates the price of in-game items relative to player statistics. The system identifies players in the game who have not yet spent any money, and then identifies another group of players who have similar behaviours and preferences who have spent money, to then identify the cost sensitivity of the non-payers to present them with items at the most enticing price level. This patent highlights a system that adjusts the probabilities of obtaining seemingly random rewards according to player data, such as how much credit the player has already spent and has available to spend. So these patents, I think, are showing that there is great potential for companies to make games that have a skill and story component, while also making them less skill-driven and beatable in certain areas in order to encourage players to spend money. And this reminds us that games are actually quite different from gambling machines in a few respects, because the designers have access to player data, including the individual's data and the data of the player population. And this means that online games can be designed so that the rewards are tailored to ensure that the individual is constantly rewarded at the level known to keep that player invested. Years ago, players used to learn more about the game with the more time they spent invested in it, developing better strategies and memorising the game's obstacles. And that's how players like Billy Mitchell here became a champion at a game like Donkey Kong. He memorised the predefined patterns and obstacles in the game. With video games featuring more randomness and monetised virtual goods and currencies, there's been a growing convergence between gaming and gambling activities. For example, it's now possible to use in-game virtual assets in some games as a form of gambling credit on an unregulated third-party site. And while these sites have no direct commercial relationship with the game developer, they have a mutually beneficial arrangement in an online ecosystem where the player will often require more currency from the game developer to spend on the third-party site. And this is an example of skin gambling, which uses graphical assets from some games to then bet on games of chance. There's been some debate about whether these activities should be considered gambling, and while there have been some regulation challenges and legal battles preventing underage access to these websites, the University of Adelaide is not only a world-leading university, but is also leading the way in blocking access to these sites too. So the final challenge is our response to gaming disorder. How do we respond effectively to the needs of people who are affected by problem gaming? And this may be the biggest challenge for the field currently, but also an area where there's been much less research. A recent, very comprehensive review reported that less than 4% of the research literature on gaming and other media addiction was concerned with the topics of prevention and treatment. Less than 4%. In the news media, these are the types of treatments that we tend to hear about. The hospitalisation approach, which may involve medication and other forms of treatment. The detox approach, or the nature retreat, where there's an emphasis on living without any devices, getting back to nature and engaging in outdoor and face-to-face social activities. And the boot camp approach that involves strict routine and discipline. A common feature of all of these treatments is that they remove the individual from their usual environment, and it's usually a teenager, as a way of disrupting the gaming routine. Parents and close family tend to have a very limited role in the therapy. The evidence for these approaches in general is very limited. There's been about 30 studies published on gaming disorder treatment, and while that may sound like a lot, many of them are very different from each other in terms of what they're offering, and they also suffer a number of methodological weaknesses. The main problem with studies of treatment in gaming disorder is that they lack a follow-up, which means that it's very difficult to say how effective the therapy is over a longer period of time. The therapy approach that right now seems to have the most preliminary support is cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. And that's a very well-established therapy that's used for a range of disorders, including depression and anxiety, as well as other addictive behaviours. Matthew, my PhD student, has performed a meta-analysis of the 13 studies that use CBT, and this table presents the results. In general, you see that studies that test the effectiveness of CBT usually have about 6 to 8 sessions, and they report a moderate-sized reduction in gaming disorder symptoms at the end of the therapy, so immediately after the therapy. As you can see on the right-hand column, there's very few studies that have employed a follow-up assessment, such as contacting the participants 3 to 6 months later to see how they're going. The 2 studies with the largest effect sizes were both conducted by Kimberly Young, who's one of the first researchers in the area of internet addiction, so she might have a bit more practice at it than others, but her studies are major outliers when compared to the others in the field. The remaining 3 studies show insignificant effects and small effect sizes for CBT. Adding to this, most treatment studies for gaming disorder that show very limited effects on reducing actual time spent gaming. For example, in one treatment study conducted in Japan, involved a 10-day intensive treatment program for young people. The participants only reduced their daily gaming time from 10 hours at baseline to 7 hours after the therapy. That's a statistically significant effect, but functionally very little has changed because the young person's still spending 45 hours a week playing games. My guess is that current CBT approaches for gaming disorder may not be optimally effective for 2 main reasons. The first is that CBT hasn't really been properly tailored for gaming yet. It tends to be adapted from gambling and substance use protocols, which overlooks the fact that gaming disorder is a very complex disorder that may need to be conceptualised differently. Gaming is also a much more varied activity and more time-intensive than addictions to, say, tobacco, and it also doesn't feature all the same cognitive features as a problem like gambling, because you can actually win in the long term. Another challenge is that most adolescents who enter some kind of therapy for gaming disorder do not see the gaming as the problem. Developing better therapies for individuals, and including adolescents who are deeply entrenched in gaming, is one option, but there's also a need for more approaches that take some action before the problems develop. For example, prevention programs that encourage young people's critical thinking about games, recognising that games can be a form of leisure and a form of art. They're also an entertainment product that's designed to make a profit, and an activity that people can misuse and become addicted to. Last of all, on the topic of treatment, I wanted to highlight a study that does have very strong methodological characteristics and some of the strongest treatment effects. There's only one study that includes measures that follows up participants and measures change in symptoms over a longer period of time. And that's a 2015 study by Liu et al. That involved family therapy for adolescents over in China. Now, what's interesting about this study is that it works primarily by focusing on the whole family unit and works at improving family communication, developing the family relationships, particularly the parent-child relationship, and the therapist and the family working together to encourage engagement in some shared activities and new skills outside the home. It's a very different approach to the detox retreat and the camps where the adolescent is isolated from the family, and it suggests that a whole family approach may be more feasible and cost effective and less distressing for young people. So while it's only one study, it reported a 90% success rate, which is quite promising. I want to end with a closing thought on games. There may be no other more accessible leisure product that provides a low effort, low reward experience of action and excitement, progress and achievement, social connection and self-expression. That may be its main selling point, but it's also part of the reason why some vulnerable people become over-involved and experience harms. It's become more essential than ever to be critical of our digital media habits, especially video games, because we are active participants in those experiences. Games are interactive, immersive, endless, and work-like, and these are the elements that give the impression of a better alternative reality that some people may feel unable to leave. There's a lot more to do in this area. There's a need for more research to understand the player-product relationship and ensure that our clinical descriptions and interventions are consistent with the activities that are commonly engaged in and cause problems for users. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, I know we're going to probably open this up to some questions, but I thought something novel to do for this talk would be to actually offer you some questions or me to ask you a few questions. So I've prepared a very short quiz of only 4 questions, and I'll be giving away some copies of the book on internet gaming disorder. So the very first question is, the word internet appears in the DSM-5 in the description of one condition other than internet gaming disorder. Can you name the disorder? Is it gambling disorder, social anxiety disorder, insomnia disorder, illness anxiety disorder, or is it about narcissism? Anyone like to take a guess?
I'm going to go A.
Wrong.
B.
D.
Sorry, I'll get over here. You say D?
I said D.
I said B.
Oh, that was wrong. D is correct.
Thank you.
Oh,
Excellent.
I won't throw any more. That'll be the last one. Okay, question 2. Which of the following well-known psychologists wrote a book on video gaming in 1983? I'll just say the areas. Was it in memory, intelligence, human development, or feminist psychology, or personality? Anyone like to take a guess?
B.
It's not B.
A.
It's A. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I won't do that again.
I'll take that.
Yep. Okay, third question. Who declared in 1982 that young people have become body and soul addicted to video games? Was it Donald Trump? Oprah Winfrey? Ronald Reagan? David Bowie? Or was it the US Surgeon General, Dr. C. Everett Koop? This is a bit of an easier question.
E.
It is E.
Can I have another book? No, that's
No more. You can give it to someone else.
Kudos.
Okay, the last question, which will touch the hearts of researchers everywhere. The top prize in professional gaming competition or esports is worth more financially than which of the following Australian Research Council research funding schemes?
All of them.
Is it a PhD? Is it the DECRA? The Future Fellowship? The Australian Laureate Scholarship? Or the grant to establish a Centre for Excellence?
E.
Last year we would have said D, but currently it's now E. Correct.
What is the top prize?
In excess of 3.2 million. I think it's closer to 4. It would be divided among 5 people though, so if that means anything. And that's all. Thank you very much again.
That's on? Good. So are there some questions?
I have a question.
Okay, I need to come to you with the microphones. It's just for recording purposes.
So I was just wondering if you could expand a bit about the patent that they have. And so are they targeting different people based on their player statistics and then actually changing what happens in the game in order to hopefully either increase spending of a player or increase time? So does the actual game itself start to change based on what's going on? Or could you just expand generally about the patent?
Yeah, it's a big topic, registered design patents. We see, if we look at the top 10 most profitable gaming companies, those that are using microtransactions are registering some of these sorts of patents, where you are seeing tactics like changing the probability of items dropping dynamically. So it's not always clear to the player how much they need to spend in order to get a certain item. Also using very limited disclosure of the product. So we're starting to get more into an area outside of gambling and more related to consumer protection standards, where it's not always clear what you're getting for your money. And there was a really interesting study that was done in Norway very recently, where a researcher spent about 5,000 euros on a game called FIFA, soccer game, buying what's called loot boxes, to see whether or not the company's statement on what you would get out of loot boxes matched the actual probabilities of the rewards he was getting out of loot boxes. And he found that after spending 5,000 euros on the game, that he didn't get a single card related to some of the top soccer players. So he didn't get his Cristiano Ronaldo, I don't know any other players. And that highlighted that even though the system said, you know, you've got this probability, it's actually very unlikely that you're going to get what you're looking for. The point I should probably make about these patents is they're just patents. It doesn't necessarily mean that the game or the company is exploiting that IP to use it in the game. But it does show that the research priority, or the research and development priorities of those companies, is in introducing microtransactions. It's a really interesting area because it's very hard to evaluate these. They're sort of very different across games. And we're seeing in some jurisdictions like Belgium recently, they've banned loot boxes and required the company that offered them to take them out of the games. So we can only really go on what the patents are describing, and we don't always know whether they're being implemented, but there's certainly some evidence in those that something's happening.
It's all about making money, isn't it, at the end of the day?
I don't have to say that because that's what the industry says. They've said, this is just a product, these are no different to basketball cards. It's about novelty and surprise for the player. Now, I don't necessarily agree that it's the same as basketball cards, because at least with basketball cards you can sell them on to somebody else, or you can give them away, but you can't often do that with virtual goods. And also with basketball cards, you don't own a basketball card vendor in your home that is linked to your credit card that you can pay over and over and over. And the basketball card isn't saying to you, would you like to spend more? Here's a special limited time offer, and so on. So there's a lot of very structural differences between those two activities.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, if not, I'd like to thank Daniel again for an excellent talk. I feel like I've been missing out on a whole aspect of life that I probably won't rush off to get involved in, but clearly it's an area of importance, particularly to our young people. And so it's been good to get the range and looking at epidemiology and comorbidity and impact on brain, and some thinking about treatment. So great to see social sciences involved in this really cutting edge area. So I'd like us to thank Daniel one more time.